Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by BetDSI. Hey, you looking for a place to bet on NFL and NCAA football? BetDSI is the industry leader in football betting and the perfect sportsbook for both novice and professional bettors alike. New members get a 100% bonus match when you use the promo code SEATS100. Yeah, that's SEATS100 at betdsi.com. That's more than double your money to help start winning today. Once again, betdsi.com, promo code SEATS100, and get your limited time 100% bonus offer when you deposit today. Now, here's our show.
There is probably no single area holding so much of charm and beauty and the good things of life as Southern California. From the beautifully designed Spanish-type station at Los Angeles, in the heart of the City of the Angels, the thrill of Southern California is in the air. In the years since the turn of the century, Los Angeles has grown from a sleepy pueblo to a vast, seething metropolitan city. Fine buildings, huge stores, busy citizens. A city which has grown faster than any other in America in the past decade, and which sees a constant day-to-day influx of people from every part of the world. Of course, no look at Southern California would be complete without a round of Hollywood. This is Hollywood Boulevard and the world-renowned Grauman's Chinese Theater. In the forecourt of this celebrated cinema house are the footprints of the outstanding stars of the screen. Here, the idols of millions have left mementos of their undying fame. Radio and television, too, are focal points of Hollywood life, and the great broadcasting systems are important additions to the entertainment business, which contributes to the lifeblood of this community. At Sunset and Vine stands the western headquarters of the National Broadcasting Company, source of many favorite programs. Just down Sunset Boulevard is the Columbia Broadcasting System, outlet for thousands of hours of radio pleasure and television spectacles. This great network, along with NBC, ABC, and Mutual, draws thousands of enthusiastic radio and TV fans who come to see the stars and programs. Baseball occupies a prominent spot in the entertainment sports picture of Southern California. Both Hollywood and Los Angeles have teams that draw an ample quota of loyal rooters.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right there, friends. How you doing? My name is Tim Hanlon, and it's a Good Seats Still Available. How is it going? We appreciate you finding us and downloading us, putting us in your earbuds. And of course, Good Seats Still Available is the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. We appreciate it to no end. You're going out of your way to find us this week and listen in as we get into some fun times back in the 1950s when Los Angeles was this on the rise metropolitan area where everything was possible, and ribbons of highways and all kinds of great culture and weather and all that kind of stuff. None of the ills that sort of comprise a lot of the current Southern California experience with so much population and all that kind of stuff. But back in the 50s, it was a kinder, gentler time, and baseball very prominent in this metropolis, this budding metropolis known as Los Angeles and environs. And we talked about one of those baseball teams in the Pacific Coast League, that being essentially pretty damn close to major league quality on any given day or year. And Lord knows the Pacific Coast League tried on a couple of different occasions to kind of elevate themselves, either by willing themselves or at least trying to be confused with the two major leagues. And it's debatable, but as to whether the talent and the play was at that caliber. But I think you'd find more than a few people, and not just nostalgists either, who would have said that the caliber of play was pretty high and arguably equal to that, at least, of the major leagues. And Los Angeles had two of those Pacific Coast League teams for a large part of the Pacific Coast League's early and, actually just curtailed recently. Existence just ended really last year with the realignment of minor leagues and Major League Baseball. We talked about the first one back in our episode number 208 with our pal Dan Taylor, those being the Hollywood Stars. Yeah, Gilmore Field. And I guess we're sort of now near where CBS Television City and the Farmers Market area is and stuff. That's sort of where Gilmore Field was located. And to its name had a bevy of Hollywood stars as part of their ownership. But the other team we're going to get into today with our guest this week, Galen White, we're going to talk about the Los Angeles Angels of the Pacific Coast League. Yeah, the LA Angels was a team that played in the Pacific Coast League for a whole bunch of its existence, I think the team itself existed as early as 1892. But when the Pacific Coast League began in earnest in 1903, there were the Los Angeles Angels, and they lasted for, a good almost 50 some odd years. And it's a fascinating tale. And again, Los Angeles, in some respects, the populace didn't really sort of know any better, right? This was the now third largest metropolitan area in the 1950s as we focus our lens on the LA Angels history. Our discussion is actually going to be more focused on a period of time in the 50s with the Angels, and in particular highlighted by the 1956 last for them championship of the Angels in that league. And what a time it was. The book is called The Bilko Athletic Club, the story of the 1956 Los Angeles Angels. And the sort of key person in that story by his name is a guy named Steve Bilko. Now, Bilko, that sounds like an interesting name. Where have I heard that one before? Oh, maybe that sounds like Sergeant Bilko from the old Phil Silvers show. Really dating myself. But yes, make no mistake, there is no mistake. The name Bilko for that show was indeed, if you will, stolen or borrowed heavily, shall we say, by Nat Hiken, who created the Phil Silvers show and frankly brought Phil Silvers to certainly a higher level of fame than he ever had before, because he was a fan, Hiken was, of this Steve Bilko character who for 3 years in between major league stops played and was revered as the star player, the star attention grabber for the Los Angeles Angels. I mean, knocking it out of the park, literally and figuratively, with home runs and all kinds of other batting records. And he was, by all accounts, in that period of time, about as big a star as you were going to find locally in the Los Angeles area. Steve Bilko was essentially like the Babe Ruth, if you will, of the Los Angeles baseball scene. And again, there was no Major League Baseball at this time. The Dodgers hadn't moved here yet. The Giants hadn't moved here yet, 1957. This was, or 58 for the first season. This 1956, you have to understand, this was essentially not only the peak of the LA Angels experience in the PCL, but this was essentially really a proving ground, this PCL, this Angels team, the Hollywood Stars too, that Los Angeles was more than ready for top-tier baseball. And through a whole bunch of different sort of intriguing situations and dramatic turns, the Angels became essentially kind of a pawn in the Dodgers actually coming to Los Angeles. It was the ownership of the Angels, the various intrigue behind how the Dodgers wound up coming to Los Angeles. Hey, Steve Bilko even was part of some of that effort. Chavez Ravine and its location and its frankly being given away in many respects to the Dodgers organization. All of that is encompassed in this fascinating story. So we talk about all this stuff about the Los Angeles Angels of the Pacific Coast League. The 1956 version is largely the central part of this conversation. And Steve Bilko is largely the face around it. But make no mistake, there's a lot of other stuff here. There's the formation of the Los Angeles Angels, part of how Brooklyn wound up coming to Los Angeles, why and how Dodger Stadium got to where it became located, what happened to Steve Bilko both before his turns as the star player of the Angels as well as afterwards. And interestingly, at the very end of his career in 1961, guess what? He actually became one of the first players to be brought into the Los Angeles Angels expansion franchise in 1961 of Major League Baseball. Yes, that's Orange County, ultimately getting their franchise, but it was a second LA Major League Baseball team. And Steve Bilko got to play his last 2 seasons of professional ball for the team and the name that he starred with in the late 1950s in the PCL version of the Los Angeles Angels. Keep up with me, friends. This is a fascinating conversation about a more wonderful and joyful and optimistic, I guess, less cynical time in baseball history. It's the Pacific Coast League, the Los Angeles Angels, and the 1956 version in particular, with our guest this week, Galen White, and it's a treat. You'll enjoy the conversation, and it's coming up in just a moment's time. We, of course, want to thank one of our great sponsors, and we're going to go back to the well again with our friends at Royal Retros. That's royalretros.com. And Dustin Alameda and his pals there put all kinds of great blood, sweat, and tears into their offerings. And this week is no exception. How about a wonderful throwback jersey, custom made. It ships in about 4 to 6 weeks. You can get your name on it and stuff, but literally painstakingly crafted and derived from all the great photography to the point of being about as accurate as you're going to find. A Los Angeles Angels throwback jersey from 1942. It's wonderfully made. It's got the little LA logo there. It's got a really cool health logo. It looks like it was some kind of a sort of a sponsorship of some sort. It's got Los Angeles across the front. If you want the away version in gray, there are 2 different versions to choose from. And it's one of just the many, many throwback jerseys and customizable at that you can find, along with t-shirts and other great stuff at Royal Retros, royalretros.com. They call themselves the King of Throwbacks. And of course, you'll see why by going to the site. And of course, once you find what you're going to put down your hot little cash or PayPal or Venmo for, I don't think they take Bitcoin yet, but whatever you choose and whatever you choose to buy, make sure that you enter this promo code at checkout. It's SEATS, SEATS, SEATS. That's the promo code for 10% off all of your purchases at royalretros.com. And again, the Los Angeles Angels throwback jersey from 1942. It's smart looking and just one of a bevy of great items for you to choose from at our pals. And thank you for their sponsorship, of course, at royalretros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did, as they say. All right, as we say, let's get into it, shall we? Here's our great conversation with Galen White. Wonderful topic, wonderful conversation and discussion. And I learned a lot about the baseball scene in the 1950s. I almost wish I had sort of been around to experience it, but why reminisce about something that's not possible when you can talk to the person who was actually there in the flesh and can kind of give us a clear-eyed view of it? Here's our conversation with Galen White we had just a couple of days ago. Please, as always, enjoy. I wanted to get maybe a little bit of a background before we get into this fun story about the LA Angels of the Pacific Coast League back in the day in '56. You started actually as a sports writer in earnest before kind of going off in a different direction career-wise. And do I kind of have this right that you kind of have, if you will, boomeranged back into sports writing, albeit in a different form?
Well, I had unfinished business, you might say, Tim. I started out as a sports writer. You're correct. I left California to go to the University of Oklahoma so I could be part of a great football program there. Bud Wilkinson was in his last year as coaching when I was a freshman. I went back out to California to go to junior college because my girlfriend at the time was dating someone else, and I didn't want her to. So eventually we got married. I returned to Oklahoma and went into sports writing. and found out I needed a little bit more money to raise the family that I had. So I went into the corporate world. But when I did that, I had already started some things that I wanted to complete. The research on the Bilko book, see, Bilko died in 1976. So 78. I interviewed him in 76, November, and went to Nanticoke, Pennsylvania. So I'm glad I started it then. That was the beginning. Two of my books, Bilko Athletic Club and Left on Base in the Bush Leagues, were started in the 70s. So for many years, I had these two books hanging out there. They were kind of gorillas on my back. And finally, I finished them after I retired from the corporate world. And along with those two, I've done 3 other books.
So I think that's great because you've essentially, you kind of started in earnest in what you thought was a passion or a calling, realized sort of the realities of life, and having been a fledgling journalist in my early years as well, and then kind of fleeing to the semi-safer world of corporate advertising and then by extension media technology and investments and that kind of stuff. But this podcast in an odd way is sort of a way for me, although I'm not retired per se from the day job. It's at least it allows me to proverbially scratch that itch in an audio form with a topic and a zone of interest for whatever reasons around teams and leagues and stuff, because nobody else is writing about them or talking about them.
Well, there are more options today to do what you're doing. When I was younger, you didn't have all these opportunities to branch out. Now, as a college student, I wanted to be both a sports writer and a sportscaster. But at that time, you didn't have very many guys doing both. It's only been in more recent years that some of the sports writers got into sportscasting. You went one way or the other at that time. I wound up going into sports writing because I just liked the printed word better, and I felt I had a greater talent in that area. And I also didn't feel that I had realized all my potential as a writer when I went into the corporate world. In fact, when I went into the corporate world, I was working for Hallmark. I was bored. So I would go out to Royal Stadium, which was new at that time. I did some work for the Royals. I also used that opportunity to do a lot of the interviews for the book, because the players like Billy Martin, well, he was a manager at the time, but a lot of the people I wanted to interview would come through Kansas City. Joe Garagiola, for example, who I interviewed extensively about Steve Bilko. So I used that time out at Royal Stadium to gather a lot of the material. And then when I started to travel a lot more in the corporate world, because I left Hallmark to go to Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, I would use my trips when I was in the area of somebody I wanted to talk to interview those players. So on the one hand, it was a blessing. On the other hand, it really did slow up the completion of the books.
Yeah, but you see kids out there as you're listening, right? That's the great way to kind of get the sort of the side hustle paid for by the man, if you will, and without sort of leaking out, right? I guess the only other, sports-related kind of realm of that would be maybe the refereeing thing, right? Which tends to be, you have to kind of that has to be more of an officially, sanctioned kind of thing, so that, both corporate environments kind of, can handle each other with schedules and that kind of stuff. But no, I mean, you're describing, frankly, a way to kind of keep the passion, the side project, the whatever, in the background, and, kind of work to live, so to speak, but then also live to work somehow, right?
Well, in the corporate world, of course, I had to keep some of these things under the radar. There were some people I could be a little bit more open with. I remember the vice president of public relations at Goodyear, who was a big sports fan, and he knew I was working on a book when they hired me. And to him, that was, I think, one of the reasons he hired me, because he liked the stories that I was telling him about what I was working on, and I think he wanted to provide a vehicle for me to finish what I had started. So it for some people it was helpful. Others, you just didn't want them to know a whole lot about what you were doing. But growing up in Los Angeles, back to the beginning, I went to games at Wrigley Field, and that is where most people will identify with Home Run Derby. The original Home Run Derbies were at Wrigley Field in Los Angeles. A lot of your television movies, Ronald Reagan was in the one where he plays Grover Cleveland Alexander. that was filmed at Wrigley Field. So a lot of your movies were filmed at Wrigley Field. That's where I went to games as a kid with my father and my brother. And I really fell in love with the ballpark and became a Cubs fan because the Angels at that time were a Cubs farm team.
Yeah, and that was going to be sort of the idea of doing this book sort of get started. Well, we had a conversation a number of months ago with Dan Taylor about the Hollywood stars, and the thing that kind of struck me in that conversation, and maybe this is sort of the grist, sort of the on-ramp to this conversation, is we'll get to the rivalry and all that stuff in Los Angeles in a second, but I almost got the feeling doing the research that the Angels were the more, if you will, Hollywood of the teams versus, say, the interestingly named Hollywood stars in terms of how many stars and filmings and those kinds of things. When you mentioned Home Run Derby, I get the feeling that Wrigley Field in L.A. was more, I guess, connoted or overlapping maybe with the entertainment industry, or do I have that wrong, or is it maybe it was more fondly or deeply remembered perhaps than the stars?
Well, Gilmore Field was located in Hollywood, and it was also owned by a group of movie stars. So it was more Hollywood, you might say. It was more glamorous. More of the actors and actresses went to games there in Hollywood. The Wrigley Field, of course, as compared with Gilmore Field, was the bigger star as a ballpark. But the fans of the Angels were more blue-collar types. Groucho Marx, however, went to games at Wrigley Field, and there were a few others. I believe Nat King Cole also went to games at Wrigley Field. But your basic clientele was quite different between the stars. It was more the glamour, the Hollywood type, the entertainers. And over at Wrigley Field, you had people like my father, who was a minister. I remember one time going to a game. Actually, we were going to a game at Wrigley Field, at Gilmore Field. And my father, an Angels fan, and his friend, also a minister, was a Hollywood Stars fan. And they started needling each other. And my dad said to him, he said, "Gene, how can you be a Christian and pull against the Angels?" So there was this rivalry. Now, he was kidding, of course, but there was this rivalry. And I went to games at Wrigley Field. I mean, it was a beautiful ballpark. You were close to the action. You were closer to the action at Gilmore Field. In fact, you were right on top of it there. It was a smaller ballpark. But Wrigley Field was built in 1925. It was really the original Wrigley Field because the Cubs called their park, which was built earlier, they called it Cubs Park until 1926 when they renamed it Wrigley. So if you're ever in a trivia contest, want to know the original Wrigley Field, it was not Chicago, it was in Los Angeles.
Well, don't get me started on the Chicago Chi Feds and the original reason and behind the whales and the actual origination.
Right.
Now I married into just not only Cub fans, but just the whole, all that comes with it. So it's a very it's now seeped into my blood, even though I grew up in the New York area. But so describe this, and we'll get into the 56th season specifically in a minute. But this was a real, out and out rivalry between these two teams, right, in the LA area. And I'm guessing that you couldn't really kind of be a fan of both. You kind of had to really kind of choose one or the other, just like any other dual team rivalry in the United States.
Red Sox, Yankees.
Yeah. Just
think of it that way. In fact, Irv Katz, who was a PR man for the Angels, the Stars, went on to do some work for the Dodgers. He compared it with the Red Sox and the Yankees, and it was just like that. There were brawls. In fact, one of the biggest fights was in Life magazine, which was a big magazine at that time, and it commanded like 6 pages of photographs. And there was some real slugging going on during that fight. In fact, they called the police out to the ballpark, and the players, only the players who were in the game could be in the dugout. The rest had to stay in the clubhouse. It gives you an idea of what that particular fight was like. But they were fighting all the time. Now, were some of them staged? Some of the players are interviews. George Freese, who played both for the Stars and the Angels, believed some of them were staged. Or at least, there was something done to try to create the friction that would lead to a fight. But the fans got into it, let me tell you that. And the Stars-Angels games, My father was not one to get too worked up about anything, but he got worked up over the Stars Angels games, as well as my brother and I.
Yeah, I'm guessing it was also aided and abetted by the fact that Los Angeles it wasn't the second largest metropolitan area like it is today, but it was certainly on the hugely upward trajectory, right? Because of the film industry and the entertainment industry and just growing all kinds of different industries and stuff. And media, right, was pretty pronounced there. And I'm guessing perhaps unlike, any other quote unquote minor league, we'll get into that in a minute. You had, top tier television stations and radio stations covering this thing like it was an American League or a National League kind of setup.
Well, the two announcers were quite well known. Mark Scott was the announcer on Home Run Derby. He was the Stars play-by-play announcer. Bob Kelly, who best known as the voice of the LA Rams, and his voice and faces appears in a lot of movies that related to football. So Kelly was the play-by-play announcer for the Angels. Neither liked each other. Their animosity towards each other was real. That translated into the airways, and it riled up the fans. Then you had players on the Stars side like Carlos Bernier. He was from Puerto Rico, had a hot temper. Bobby Bragan was a manager there, and the Stars had more players kicked out in one of the seasons. I think it was 1953 it was, because that's when Bernier and Bobby Bragan were together for the first time. Probably during the course of that year, they probably got kicked out a combined 50 times. It was amazing. They were getting kicked out all the time. There were fights all the time. And Mark Scott, his sign-off on his broadcast was, and remember, sports fans, whether you win or lose, always be a good sport. Well, that little sign-off slogan would rile my brother and I up, and I thought, how could this bunch talk about being a good sport when they're fighting all the time?
Yeah, that's something. So, but I guess then growing up in LA, this was essentially as close as a thing to a top tier sports rivalry, right? I mean, I'm sure you followed baseball, in the Eastern hinterlands, right? But this is before the time, not until the late 50s, right? Till the two New York teams obviously boldly moved to California. I mean, this was the Pacific Coast League was. I wouldn't even call it borderline professional, because I think even Pants Rowland, who was running the league at the time, had eyes towards taking this kind of competition and the solid talent that was all up and down the West Coast, the Pacific Coast League, and almost maybe even going into the major leagues somehow, some way.
Well, most of the players in the league, in the Pacific Coast League, had played in the majors. There were some of the younger players. Bill Mazeroski, Hall of Famer with the Pirates. He came up through Hollywood. He was an 18-year-old playing for the Hollywood Stars. Mudcat Grant, who went on to have a great career in the majors, he came through with San Diego Padres. And if you go back further, Joe DiMaggio and Dom came out of the San Francisco Seals. Ted Williams came out of the San Diego Padres, as did Bobby Doerr, both Hall of Famers. So the league produced a lot of great players over the years. Somehow or another, after the World War II, it still had a lot of major leaguers in there, but they were more past their prime. And they preferred playing on the West Coast. They made more money. They traveled by plane. And the climates were much more conducive to a player who wanted to play longer, because you didn't have the humidity and the heat of the East. You traveled by plane rather than by train. So the players liked playing on the West Coast. And then for much of the period after World War II, leading up to the Dodgers and Giants coming to LA in 58, you had the teams would go into a town. Let's say the San Francisco Seals would come into LA. They play Hollywood for 7 days, and then they play LA for 7 days, the Angels. So they'd stay in the same town, even though they were traveling for 14 days. You can get a lot of trouble doing that.
Okay, so explain to me then the state of the league in the 1950s. You'll see. We're getting into the season specifically. We'll get there.
Yeah.
But it feels to me that, and I'm an armchair historian at best, right? So you know this subject far better than I, and hence the sort of curiosity factor of this little show. But explain to me, in the 50s, it feels to me like the Pacific Coast League was either overtly or covertly or somewhere in between, flirting with or pursuing or not afraid to be confused with the quote unquote two major leagues in terms of all of it, right? And I guess fueled perhaps in LA in particular with two white hot rival teams.
Well, so you had a combination of things. We as fans, we had, you might say, and I still do to some degree, although I'm getting over it, Tim, a chip on our shoulders about the Eastern sports writers and their arrogance. They were always putting down teams from the West Coast, including our football teams. I was a big UCLA Bruins football fan, and the rivalry with USC was a great rivalry. But nobody talked about it back east. It was all, as far as west as they went in terms of their interest and their coverage, was Notre Dame and South Bend. So we were left out of most of the conversations, both in football and baseball. So to us, the Pacific Coast League was our major league. We made no apologies for it. These players, we saw some great players come through the league. And of course, a lot of the teams played exhibition games out in L.A. I remember in 1955, the Cleveland Indians and the New York Giants playing a game at Wrigley Field. They packed Wrigley Field out. Capacity was only 25,000. But it was a replay of the World Series the year before between the Indians and the Giants. It was a great, and it was just, we saw our Major League Baseball in the spring when the teams would come out there, and a lot of them did spring training there and there in California or Arizona. And then, of course, during the regular season, we saw the Coast League. And to us, it was as good as what we saw. Now, the only Major League Baseball we saw through much of the 50s would be at the end of the season, would be the World Series, and there'd be the Dodgers against the Yankees every year, ho-hum. It was great baseball, but we didn't see much of it. What we saw mostly was in the ballparks of the West Coast.
But that's also, it's not like you didn't know any better, right? I mean, you saw national coverage or sort of read, right? Yeah. But indeed, it was sort of this sort of, I guess, East Coast or Midwest and or Midwestern provincial kind of approach, because it wasn't, quote unquote, the major leagues.
Oh, we knew about Willie Mays and Stan Musial and greatly appreciated it. In fact, my father, I remember traveling east one summer and took us to a game at Old Busch Stadium, and we saw Stan Musial play. I remember quite well. Harvey the Cat McKean was a pitcher for the Cardinals. I would have been 6 years old. That was 1952. Later years, of course, I went to Wrigley Field in Chicago, and that was great. But I felt, hey, I didn't even know the one in L.A. was the originally named L.A. before Chicago. But I felt, look, I enjoyed it more in L.A. than I did in Chicago, because when I went to the games in Chicago, it wasn't like today. There was a lot of empty seats, and there were kids running around taking the seats that were up and clapping them down, making a lot of noise. So I more enjoyed the games in L.A. than Chicago.
Yeah, and the park was probably a little bit more intimate, even more so than Wrigley here in Chicago in terms of its
absolutely, yeah, it was. Yeah. Well, like I say, if you watch the original Home Run Derby, and you get a pretty good feel. There were houses behind the left field wall, and Steve Bilko and another player who they had in 1955, and I write about in the Bilko Athletic Club, Buzz Clarkson. He'd been a great Negro Leagues player and also played in Puerto Rico, had a lot of power. He was close to 40 years old when he came to L.A. in 1955. He had hit 42 home runs the previous year in the Texas League. Buzz targeted this one house over the left field wall, and he once hit a hole through the door over there. There was a picture in the paper of kids looking at the hole. I mean, those were the kind of things that really enamored you with the ballpark and its players. They became king-size heroes to us. Not as well known to the rest of the country, of course. I mean, Willie Mays and those players, Mickey Mantle, were known all over the country. And our stars often were not. Although, Steve Bilko, who, again, I write about in the Bilko Athletic Club, he had some fine years with the St. Louis Cardinals. His rookie season, he had 21 home runs in 1953. So he'd been to the majors, and many of the players in the Coast League had been to the majors before they came out and played for the Angels or the Stars.
All right. right, what's this? Bet DSI. All right. Well, hey, you're looking for a place to bet on NFL and NCAA football? Well, Bet DSI is an industry leader, perhaps even the industry leader in football betting, and is the perfect sports book for both novice and professional bettors alike. At Bet DSI, you can also enjoy live in-game betting. So what's that mean? Well, it means you can not only bet your favorite teams, but you can do that and all kinds of different prop bets and various situations all game long on nearly every play to the final whistle. BetDSI's been around for 20 years and paying winners all along the way. 10,000 and more betting options daily on all the sports you love to watch. Daily fantasy, top ratings on all the betting review sites, you name it. BetDSI is the way to go. They've got a very user-friendly interface and mobile site and has the fastest payouts in the industry. Simply play, you win, and you get paid. Doesn't get better than that. Plus, BetDSI offers betting options for just about everything. NFL, college football, sure, but NBA, NHL, UFC, golf, other sports, politics even, reality TV, esports, virtually everything. Try live betting at BetDSI, and you can bet on every major sport and event through the entire game, every play, and every minute. So, new members, that's what you're here for, right? New members get a 100% bonus match to their deposit when you use the promo code SEATS100. Again, 100% a bonus match when you use promo code SEATS100. That's more than double your money to start winning today. So once again, go to betdsi.com and use the promo code SEATS100 and get this limited time 100% bonus offer and make some extra cash on the sports you know and love. And additionally, if you use Bitcoin, you'll get an additional 100% deposit bonus on your first two deposits up to $2,000. It all adds up to BetDSI being the place to do your betting as the football season approaches. It's only a game until you bet it at BetDSI. Thank you, BetDSI, for your sponsorship of this episode. And now, back to our conversation. All right, so set the tone here for the team circa 1956. I guess this is really another way of asking. Put the Angels into context for me in the 1950s. This is obviously a number of years and maybe still not before the rumblings and maybe the admission that two major league teams were going to come and colonize California. But put the Angels in perspective in the 50s, sort of paint a picture for me. And I think it's also helpful, too, through the eyes of your childhood, right? I will say that having done this show for, almost 5 years now, there is definitely a thread about teams and leagues and whatnot in young adults, certainly generally males, but not exclusively, in their childhood, their impressionable youth, when it comes to sports and the teams or leagues that come across their immediate radar as they're growing up. There's an attachment there, right? And it's it kind of is sort of gilded, I guess, into one's memory, and it's. I have a feeling this is sort of a similar situation with you.
It's Field of Dreams stuff, Tim. I have a friend, Bill Swank, who's a baseball historian for, in particular, the San Diego Padres. He once said to me, the greatest era of baseball, Galen, is when you're a kid. And that really is, because you're impressionable. These are your first heroes. You're not cynical. You see these guys just through the eyes of a kid. And so let's say a Steve Bilko, who was a massive man, 6'1", 235 pounds. That was probably at his lightest. He often played as heavy as 270 pounds. I mean, he looked like Babe Ruth to me when I saw him for the first time as a 9-year-old in 1955. Buzz Clarkson, who was on that same team, and I mentioned him earlier, he was a black man, played in the Negro Leagues. Tremendous power. He looked like old man Moses at third base, the way he moved, but he was a good fielder. And when he hit the ball, I thought he was Josh Gibson, although I didn't know much about Josh Gibson at that time. So these players that you would see, they were. It was like in the movies. They were much larger than life, not only because you're a kid, but because these guys were not well known outside of the areas where they played. So when they came to us, we then sort of adopted them as if they're your own. And I think that's one of the great things about minor league baseball, and one of the reasons that I've written so much about the minors, is that when the players pass through these small towns, these towns connect with those players, and then they associate with these players as they go on in their careers. They become part of that town. So when the Angels had, and I was even younger, Gene Baker, an outstanding shortstop, black shortstop, who joined the Angels in 1950. Now, I was just thinking about this the other day. I remember Baker playing. I was 6 years old, 6 and 7. He played with the Angels for 4 years. He wasn't called up until 53. And when he went up same time as Ernie Banks. And he was a better shortstop, by the way, than Ernie Banks. But he was older and more experienced, and he moved to second base. And so Ernie Banks and Gene Baker became the first all-black double-play combination. So Baker, I started to follow him with the Angels, where he became initially my favorite player with the Cubs. And then, of course, Ernie Banks took over, and he became Mr. Cub, and he became my favorite as well. But the players, it was like you discovered these players when you were a small kid. And then you followed them on through their career. And that's the way it was for some other guys who came from the Angels and went on up. I didn't remember seeing Frankie Baumholtz play with the Angels, but he went on to star for the Cubs. And because I knew he'd played for the Angels, well, I automatically followed him. One of my books I did with Ransom Jackson, and that book is called Accidental Big Leaguer. And he was a two-time All-Star for the Cubs, then went on to play for the Dodgers, and he actually replaced Jackie Robinson when Jackie retired. I wrote a book again with Ransom Jackson, and I had first heard of Ransom because he played for the Angels. And I might not have even done the book, except that I was so fascinated with his history. He'd played college football at TCU in Texas, played in the same backfield as Bobby Lane, a great quarterback at Texas and in the NFL. So I write about Ransom, and I kind of get my fill of the Cubs in the early 50s. So yeah, it's been writing about all these books, but particularly the 56 Angels was, you might say, a love letter. In fact, I had somebody tell me that the book read like a love letter. That's fine. I hope it conveyed some of the passion that I felt at that time.
Well, let's talk about Bilko, because it sounds like he's not only the star, but also indicative of the types of players that were sprinkled around this Angels team, and maybe even by extension some of the other PCL clubs too, because this is a guy, right, who got his start with the Cardinals, right, in the National League, 49 to 54, had a fairly significant cup of coffee with the Cubs, and then effectively got, if you will, sent down, right, to the LA Angels, which, interestingly, and maybe we'll get into this, but either rejuvenated his career or proved the National Leaguer types wrong about his abilities, or maybe a combination of the two. But I'm getting a sense that, kind of alluding to my observation earlier, right, this Pacific Coast League, right, was just as stocked with quote-unquote major leaguers as the major leagues themselves, whether they were going up or down, or frankly just not given a fair shake in the other, those other leagues.
Well, let's kind of break it down this way. Bilko broke in with the Cardinals at age 20. He was thrown into the middle of a pennant race in 1949. The Cardinals were nip and tuck with the Dodgers. The Dodgers wound up winning the pennant, but Bilko did quite well in the brief period of time he was played near the end of the season. They had some injuries, and Bilko was at first base, and he you might say, carried his weight. For the 1950 season, they played Bilko up as if he was going to be the next Lou Gehrig, the next Jimmy Fox. The publicity that Bilko got was tremendous. He came to spring training in the eyes of the Cardinals overweight. They also tried to make him a pole hitter. He was not a pole hitter. His power was to left center and right center. So they wound up and Joe Garagiola, I write about this in the book, they wind up putting him in a sweatsuit to lose this weight, and he lost a tremendous amount of weight in a short period of time. It was something you wouldn't see today. It was just ridiculous. But here was a guy, too, that could hit as Garagiola said, he could hit a ball over a fence with his elbow, and they were trying to make a pole hitter out of him. So the combination of making him a pole hitter, finding him if he was over a certain weight that they had specified for him, it played with the guy's head. And Bilko was a simple guy. He wanted to be loved. He wanted to succeed. He wanted to lose weight, as his managers wanted him to do. But it didn't help. He was a great beer drinker, too, by the way. But he just couldn't do it. So he wound up, after a few failures with the Cardinals, in 1953, he is batting cleanup for the Cardinals. He's there with Stan Musial, Reggie Haynes, having a great year. And he drove in 84 runs as a rookie, hit 21 home runs. His batting average was .251. He did lead the league in strikeouts, but if I gave you the number, 125, that's nothing compared to what these guys strike out today. So Bilko had a great rookie season. It so happened that the Cardinals did not have a black player. And on the West Coast, there was a first baseman named Tom Alston, who had hit quite a few home runs in San Diego, which was a ballpark very friendly to left-handers. The Cardinals made Tom Alston their first black player. Well, he was going head-to-head to Bilko, and the Cardinals decided to keep Alston and get rid of Bilko. That's how he wound up with the Cubs. Well, the Cubs had a pretty good first baseman named D. Fondy, a better fielder than Bilko, but not as good a hitter. Bilko didn't get a chance to play much at all. Although, Ransom Jackson saw him play enough to where I remember in talking with Ransom about Bilko, he said he hit the ball like the old cartoons where they have the baseball goes off screaming in the distance. And that's the way Bilko was. He was a great power hitter. Come the 55 season, the Cubs sent him to Los Angeles. Bilko did not want to go. He is from Nanticoke, Pennsylvania. He did not want to play on the West Coast. He had previously played in the minors in Rochester, much closer to his home. So he didn't want to go to Los Angeles until the manager there at the time, Bill Sweeney, said to him, "I'm not going to bother you about your weight. I'm going to leave you alone. I don't want to know what you weigh." Well, that was music to Bilko's ears. Nobody was going to be nagging him about his weight. Well, he had a great season that first year. He hit 37 home runs. That was 1955. In 1956, he's like Babe Ruth. He wins the Triple Crown on the West Coast. He hits 55 home runs, leads the league in hitting, 164 runs batted in. So I'm 10 years old when Bilko has this Ruthian-type season in Los Angeles. So who do you think I think he is? Babe Ruth. and I wasn't the only one. You've heard of Bobby Grich, who was a fine ball player with the Baltimore Orioles and the California Angels. Grich is a couple years younger than I, and he wrote one of the blurbs for the book, and he said that to him, Steve Bilko was Babe Ruth, Mickey Mantle, and Ted Williams all rolled into one, and that's the way we felt.
In doing your research, what was his state of mind going from the Cubs, if you will, down to the minors in Los Angeles? This is I in doing some of my crack research, right? Bilko was at least the Cubs announcer in '54 was hoping he would be part of a double play combo that he could nickname Bingo to Bango to Bilko. It didn't sort of work out that way. There were a handful of games where that could have been the case, but I get the sense that he was kind of known and had some kind of cachet, and all of a sudden now he's being, if you will, sent down to the minors, albeit the Pacific Coast League, right? Unique in its own way, but it's clear that he responded quite well and became the vital cog and truly a star when he came to Los Angeles. But I have the feeling that he didn't sort of feel that way as he was getting ready to pack up and go.
No, at first he did not want to be there. Then and at first he struggled. But midway through the 55 season, he took off. The fans, he quickly became a favorite of the fans after hearing a few boos early on. But the fans fell in love with him. He became a folk hero. He was an original folk hero. Keep in mind, L.A. had not had, other than in football, had not really had any great stars. They'd had in the college ranks John Arnett. They'd had with the Rams, Bob Waterfield, Norm Van Brocklin, but no one in baseball because they hadn't had a major league team. So here comes Bilko, this big guy. He had been in the majors. He was an affable guy. Everybody loved Steve Bilko. And other people were like me. They'd go to the ballpark and see Bilko hit one of these monster home runs, and he looked like Babe Ruth. Well, guess what? He became our Babe Ruth. He was also kind of a guy that people could relate to. He watched Lawrence Welk on television. He preferred roller derby in terms of other things he watched. He liked his favorite song was "White Sports Coat" and a pink. Marty can't think Robbins song, "A White Sports Coat and the Pink Carnation." He he was a beer drinker. He didn't like wine. The other thing that helped him out was in 1955 there was a television series that came out called "You'll Never Get Rich," starring Phil Silvers. It became known as the Phil Silvers Show. Well, guess what? Character he plays, Sergeant Bilko. Why did they call it Sergeant Bilko? Well, it's because the producer and Neil Simon was one of the screenwriters. Bilko was their favorite player. So they picked Steve Bilko as Phil Silvers' name. Silvers is quoted as saying, "I could have just as well been Corporal Hodges or Private First Class Musial. I gave it to a guy who needed it." So that was Steve Bilko. People could connect with him. It
sounds like there's a relatability there, and that hiking.
Oh yeah,
and all that. Yeah, I can see where that can literally rub off, if you will.